What's up, guys? Tim Halstead here, DragBoss Garage. Look, I'm going to do an interview here with someone that I've known for years, at least since 2003,
Wow.
by name only. His name is Chad Decatur, Reverend Decatur, Reverend Cleveland. He has on the screen there.
Salutations to the Cleveland community out there, many of my friends and colleagues out there, and welcome, Tim, and thank you for inviting me. My gratitude for inviting me on your broadcast.
The pleasure's all mine. It is a true pleasure. I've heard about you for almost 20 years, all the facts that you know, and I'll kind of give the subscribers a little insight. Chad grew up in the hotbed of hot rodding back in the day, Southern California, man, and that's where all the hot rod guys came from. Vanola pistons, Iski cams. We can get on to that another topic, because I think what we're going to do is plan to do a series of interviews, and it's hard to express my gratitude that you took time out of your day to spend time with my subscribers here at DragBoss Garage. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for that, Tim. And you know, just right back at you, I have to express gratitude for you for not only, of course, satisfying those that are currently have always been fans of the Boss 302 Cleveland platform, Clevor platform, but also for the fact that I believe that you are building new subscribers, new adherents, and hobbyists that are interested in this much maligned, much misunderstood platform of engines. I believe you're doing a great service to bring others to it, especially to perpetuate this beyond the folks that are in our age confines, to also get kind of younger folks to understand the history of where their own canted valve engines have evolved from. It's likely from the Cleveland itself and all that it achieved during its short public reign, sponsored reign, and well beyond it when independents ran it as well. So thank you for that, and for you sacrificing your family time to educate others, and essentially at great expense to yourself. You're not quite monetized yet, but we are all still hoping for you, of course, in that regard.
Thank you. It is a big endeavor, not just for myself, but you're right. My family too. It's a sacrifice on them for time to do this. It takes a lot of time to put this all together, but I don't want it to go down without a fight. I want to at least give it one more round to let people see, because this stuff's over 50 years old. Let them see what these engines did, to let them bring back that pro stock time, the time when the development of engines from 70 to 74, 75 was outrageous in high performance. That's where it all came from. And the people, the legends, the people that you know are just extraordinary, the stories that you've told me. And I want to retell it to my subscribers and show them right front row what it's like to have a pro stock Cleveland running at $8,000. You know, how much horsepower they made. All about the Mopars, you know, their pro stock history.
Absolutely.
You know, Canner and AMC, you know, Mannequins, all that stuff. I want to bring it all in. And I kind of wanted to just touch one question, because I wanted to just make this brief.
Sure.
Because I know you're a busy man, and we can kind of talk about your credentials or what your experience is maybe on another interview.
Sure.
But maybe touch base on the SK cylinder heads that you had sent me pictures of, because I'm going to make a video that's going to hopefully be out tonight on this, and maybe shed some light on that these are where the Cleveland 4-barrel head came from.
That's correct. That's correct, Tim. Thank you for that. Yes, what happened is how I happened to cross these heads, I think, is probably the place to start, because as you've said, I'm a Southern California native, and I'm still a resident of Southern California. There's an independent pro stock racer named Paul Jenkins, and he was based in the Daytona, Florida area. And we all have a fondness for independent racers, even if it's not pro stock, if it was Top Fuel or Funny Car. The independent racers are really the folks that are nearest and dearest to many of us, because the independent racer could have been the person that lived right next door or across the street from you. They may have had their race car and their toter home or whatever right in their driveway. So we have definitely a fondness for the independent racer, and rather than perhaps the folks with the huge stacker trailers. We have admiration for them as well. But grassroots, of course, is the core of racing and what we can all most identify with. And Paul Jenkins is certainly emblematic of what an independent racer was. Paul's still alive. Bless God for that. He's still alive. To describe him, he's a master machinist, engine machinist. He's a fabricator. He's an engine builder, at least he built engines for himself and occasionally for others as well. And of course, he was a fabricator as well. Like many other independents and hot rodders, he gained a fascination for the new pro stock class, which by the time he entered into it, it was a few years old, early 70s, he joined it, the early pro stock fascination. And he was a Cleveland guy of sorts, the pro stock Pintos, that by that time they'd moved to the kind of the compact vehicles. The Chevy guys were running the Vegas, of course, and the Ford guys were running the Pintos, and the AMC guys were running their Gremlins, right? And those were kind of the three platforms folks were running. And so it comes as no surprise that Paul adopted a Pinto, especially because the Pro Stock Pinto book had been published widely and been used, and it documented the exploits of both M&S Welding out here in Azusa that did some of the original Pro Stock Pintos, and of course Wolverine, which was in Michigan, that did some of the original Pro Stock Pintos as well. So he, of course, built his own Pro Stock Pinto, and it was actually, strangely you might say, it was modeled after the Motown missile.
Wow. And
so we all learn from each other, right?
Sure.
Paul, being a brilliant machinist and fabricator, he saw the Motown missile. He asked for permission to do that very rare thing we get to do, which is, can I go and look under your car? That's not something that you do without permission, right? So he asked, hey, can I go look under your car? And looked around and poked around a little bit. And then he built a Pro Stock Pinto chassis, also, of course, looking at other Pro Stock Pintos and kind of merging the design and tube sizes and things of that nature. And he built a Pro Stock Pinto. Now, because he was in Daytona, of course, he was geographically friendly to Smokey Yunik's garage. And Smokey Yunik needs no introduction, and certainly least of all from me. But he's a legendary mythical figure in the motorsports world. And a lot of people don't know this about Smokey, and it's some Ford folks, but not many. They think of Smokey as simply a GM guy. He was a bow tie guy, and he was bow tie only. And that's simply not the case, because, of course, at one point, Smokey was working in partnership with Ford Engineering on Indy and Trans Am engine development projects, especially when Bunkie Knudsen, who was a GM executive, joined Ford for a very brief period of time, about 2 years, right around there, Bunkie Knudsen joined. But it's not the duration of Bunkie's tenure that matters, because even though it was like 2 years or something like that, it was a very impactful 2 years. It was a very active time, not only in GM, but of course in Ford engine development. The Trans Am wars were taking place. Sure. So it was a very pivotal time that Bunkie joined. And when he joined, of course, he had a long-standing relationship already with Smokey. So he told Smokey, and he made Ford Engineering send some of their cores and development tools and things like that, and engines and blocks and cranks and induction systems. And Smokey was involved in some of the testing and development. One thing we know about Smokey, and when I know plenty about him, but one thing we know about Smokey is, he didn't die poor, and he wasn't poor at the time. He definitely capitalized on these opportunities and made money for himself. But the reason it ties into Paul Jenkins is at some point, Paul Jenkins was informed by a friend, hey, you might want to go stop by Smokey Yunik's place when you're building the engine for your Pro Stock Pinto. He messed with a lot of these canted valve motors in engines for Trans Am and things of that nature. And he might have some stuff on the shelf that's of very little interest to him, but might be very kind of edgy items that you wouldn't normally be able to, you wouldn't get it from Holman and Moody. You wouldn't get it from a fellow racer. There might be a big bag of secrets within these. But once Smokey's done with it, if there's an opportunity to sell it or make money or broom it, then it's nothing to Smokey, and it might be gold to you. You might want to make a visit down to Smokey's. So indeed, that's what took place. And he went down to Smokey's. I think there might have been an introduction, which is best when dealing with Smokey. And sure, on the shelf was a pair of SK iron Cleveland heads. And really, I would say the predecessors to what was ultimately released, Tim, for passenger car OEM use, the 1970 quench chamber iron 4V head that we all know and adore and love. But what he had is the predecessor to those. The chambers are a little bit bigger. And of course, the cooling came out of the ends of the heads, dry deck type heads. And Paul saw those on the shelf and negotiated. We had 2 pairs of those heads on the shelf at his shop. And but Paul, being an independent racer, a regular guy, family man with a child, didn't have enough money to buy both pairs. So he bought the 1 pair, and he magged them. He's a machinist, so he magged them because and a little proviso to anybody that's messing with XE, SK, ASK, SKE heads is they're neat, or they can be neat, or any of these parts can be neat, but understand these are engineering mock-ups in some cases. These things are experiments. They're ideas, and it's important not to necessarily use them for passenger car use or endurance use without having a general understanding of what their original purpose was and what the current integrity of them is. So it didn't matter that they came from the vaunted and blessed hands of Smokey Yunik. You immediately mag them, determine how thick they are, right? And then Paul port plated them. And ported them, took them and ported beyond what they already were ported at. And they had tulip valves, I think, but he, of course, put the more conventional pro stock valves in them. And he competed with those in his Pinto. His Pinto, it was originally painted, I think, red and then green, or a maroonish wine color and then a green. But he ran that in the local events down in the southeastern part of the United States with those SKE iron heads on top of a Cleveland. And had a good time, ran good, and ran in the low 9s like those Pintos tended to run back then as an independent. And then sometime later on, he determined that, well, there's a possible risk to these heads getting damaged, a valve breaking, or maybe, porting them so heavily that they break through or that they crack from the heat and heat cycles. So he desired to go back to Smokey's shop and to buy the second pair to see if the second pair were still on the shelf.
Okay.
And indeed they were on the shelf, and he purchased the second pair of heads as well. Thankfully, and quite fortuitously, the original pair of heads that he port plated and competed with never suffered any irreparable damage. So he never deeply modified the second pair of heads. So they were basically virgin heads. And he left them on the shelf himself, but they were nice to have backup. You have, look at all your tunnel rams. You have backup for backup for backup. So I know you identify with Paul Jenkins. And then when Paul Jenkins came to near the end of his career, pro stock career, which is 1978 or so, he retired for pro stock. We all know that it started getting sponsorships. It started becoming real money. Dominators, Lenkos, all that stuff started getting really expensive. Sure. Travel, the gate entry fee, things of that nature became very, very expensive. And the disparity or the delta between an independent racer and a sponsored racer, you can't make up that gap no matter how much mile an hour you run, right? Money starts taking over.
Exactly.
And that phased out a lot of our near and dear independents. Paul being one of them. As with most independents, he needed to focus on family and making money for a living as a master machinist. So that's a little bit about Paul. But let me tell you a little bit more about Paul, because he factors into to some history even near your neck of the woods.
Okay.
He went on a tour, at least one tour, as a mechanic kind of crew chief with Fast Eddie Sharpman.
Yes.
Who I believe is up in your stomping grounds, right?
Cleveland, yeah.
Yeah, so he did at least one tour with Paul at Fast Eddie Sharpman as kind of a mechanic crew chief guy, and then also perhaps this is a really interesting nugget of history that's unpublished, but Dino Don Nicholson asked Paul to travel on the road with him as a crew chief prior to engaging with John Causey as his traveling crew chief.
Wow.
So I don't know if you want to call Paul the fifth Beatle, right? Or something like that. But just to tell you that these independents that are scattered all around the North America, and those which still live and those who have sadly passed, they had approaches. They were on the doorstep of history. Had they made a left turn or a right turn, Fortunes might have been different. Things might have changed. Their names might have been much more widely publicized. But that gives you an idea of what Dino Don Nicholson thought of Paul's skills as a machinist, a crew chief, and his integrity as a person, that he did approach him. And if you know anything about Dino, you know that certainly Dino has many accolades from sanctioned racing, NHRA, HRA, whatever. But Dino is far and away considered by anybody, whether they're a Mopar, a Chevy, or Ford person, and they carry that banner. Most people will admit that Dino, hands down, was perhaps the most prodigious and prolific match racer of that era. Nobody did more match racing than Dino. He loved it. He was basically a legal street racer. He loved match racing. Bring what bring what you have and hope it was enough. That's really who Dino was. Who's the next guy in the lane, and did he bring enough? And how creative can I be about making power, and how creative can you be about making power? So that's Paul Jenkins is tied into him. After Paul Jenkins retired from pro stock and took care of his family obligations, he still kept a relationship with Smokey and would occasionally go there and get rare pieces in furtherance of other people's builds and things like that. A little anecdote about Smokey, and this will come as no surprise to any of us that ever met Smokey, is at some point the Ford engineers, Bunkie Knudsen had long since left Ford. I think in '69, Bunkie was fired.
Yeah, he was done. Yep.
Right, he was fired. Right, and Smokey, of course, had all of these parts still in his stock, all kinds of exotica that many of you have heard about, and some of it which you have not, and some of it which was revealed in Smokey's auction, his famous auction, and some of it that never made it to the auction. But a Ford engineer, what Smokey would call a suit, because he had certainly an animus towards anybody who didn't have dirt under their nails and wearing overalls. He called these people suits in general, and he also sometimes called those guys, he had another G-rated pejorative term for folks like that. Here I am wearing a suit, so maybe Smokey thought the same of me, but I wasn't wearing a suit in the times that I met him. But anyway, the Ford engineer, the bureaucrat, as every organization has, went back to kind of check some boxes and dot some I's and cross some T's, and certainly must have had a vague inventory of some of the items that they had placed in Smokey's care through the years, through these in development periods, and was there to kind of maybe look to reclaim that. And I think also that Ford executive had heard rumors that people were using these prototype pieces in their motorsport endeavors, not only Paul for drag racing, but others for independent Trans Am racing and circle track, Cleveland racing and all of that. And that Smokey was, shall we say, coin operated.
Indeed.
That's the best way to characterize it. He was coin operated. And so that executive approached Smokey and characteristic of Smokey hurled a full cauldron of blue language and other expletives at the Ford engineer, who then scampered off the premises, never to be seen again. And then Smokey continued his coin-operated sales of whatever was in his possession, ball stud Hemis or anything else he had. GM, Chrysler. He was indiscriminate about whatever he was.
Whatever he could make money at.
Yeah, he's just coin-operated. But those heads were one of the subjects of that discussion. And he was that Ford engineer, nor did any other Ford engineers dare step foot back on the premises because I think they understood that Smokey had more blue languages and to hurl at them in reserve should they cross paths with them again. So that was the last of the Ford executives. But that was, I think, the price they paid for perhaps not going back sooner to retrieve those items as different phases of development ended. They likely should have went and reclaimed that stock and not left it dusty on Smokey's shelf, because Smokey probably considered that part of his retirement program.
at the best damn garage in town.
Yes, as you've uttered it, and the Reverend couldn't say it, but yes, as you've uttered it, exactly.
Forgive me, God.
Yeah, so that's what took place there. And then other items that Smokey didn't sell or hadn't sold at that point obviously ended up in the subsequent auction, the big famous auction he had, because you remember that one of the quotes attributed to him is, "I don't want one of these big shot suit people ending up with all of this stuff and putting it in their museums. I want real racers to use this, to buy it, to use it. And I want you to tear down the garage once all this is sold as well. I don't want this to be a museum, and I don't want the pieces we have in here to become museum pieces. So tear down this place and get rid of the stock as well." And I have other anecdotes and engagements or notes about Smokey in regards to some of the historic Trans Am restorations that colleagues and friends of mine pursued. But by and large, Smokey's behavior and conduct and attitude largely matched that which I've detailed to you in the drag racing genre.
He's larger than life. I mean, if you see pictures of him, I mean, he was like one bad dude. I saw a picture of him with like his shirt rolled up. I mean, no one messed with him.
Yes.
He knew he had the knowledge to back it up too. He was an impressive person.
Yes.
No doubt.
Yeah, he was. And certainly I would say for him personally, I'm not his financial planner, but his return on investment for his engagement with Ford was, I think, eminently more profitable than his return on investment for all that he did with GM. I think GM kind of, frankly, watched him closer, engaged with him closer. I would say that he did, he profited pretty well off of the Ford stuff, based in if I could say, in correlation to how much advancements were delivered to Ford. I would say it was disproportionate, the profit that he gained, financial profit, versus the yield that Ford actually got from that, in my opinion. Now, I know it's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, but that's my observation, and I have nothing to, I have no reason to move off of that opinion based on what I saw and all that I have actually heard and known, either firsthand or secondhand.
I read that they paid him $1 million in 1 year to come up with, for the Trans Am type stuff. $1 million he got just from Ford, just in a salary. That's what I heard. I don't know if it's true or not.
Yeah, that's the number that's been bandied about, and I have no reason to dispute that as well. And to my point, I think Smokey was obviously not just an engine guy. Obviously, he cared about suspension and weight distribution, and all of those. So it's not to in any way diminish his knowledge. He was a brilliant man, and anybody that says otherwise is not being you're being disingenuous. It doesn't matter that he was mostly a GM guy. We love these GM guys. If you don't like Lee Shepard, something's wrong with you.
Indeed.
If you don't like the work and the engineering of Grumpy Jenkins and Warren Johnson, there's something wrong with you, even though I carry a Ford banner, right?
I agree 100%. That's exactly how I feel.
Yeah, they all move the football down the field. So back to Jenkins, if I could say, obviously he went back to his family obligations, and it came a point where there was an opportunity to possibly sell some of his stock, especially when the nostalgia pro stock interest and hobby began to really take fire. And as a result, he went through some of his stock, and I don't know who to this very day, I don't know who referred him to me, because here I am in sunny Southern California, high taxes and all, earthquakes, a nice sun, but earthquakes and high taxes. Shout out to everybody in California. But somebody in the Daytona Beach area told him about Chad Decatur in California, and gave him my contact info, and he reached out to me, and we established we started corresponding, and we established a relationship, a mutual admiration relationship. And he told me some of his stock, and I endeavored to, being kind of a nostalgia pro stock, historian and hobbyist myself, I think it was a good call. I was able to kind of connect him with various people to help him, derive maximum financial value from that which he had, and he needed it. You got to remember, like a lot of these independents, they didn't get a big retirement from Ford. They didn't end up starting Dart blocks or something like that. Allen route. They went back and labored in obscurity, milling people's heads on their 383 stroker Chevy motors and just doing that. So he needed to derive as much value from them, and he sold the original port-plated Cleveland heads that he had competed with. He sold them to a mutual friend of ours who's up in the Great White North, our friend Steve, I believe.
Steve, yeah.
Yeah, Steve, and Steve has those heads, and they couldn't have landed in better hands. They went from wonderful hands from Yunick, obviously, to Paul, and then they went to Steve. So the Cleveland baton carries on, the Cleveland torch carries on. They couldn't be in better hands, I'm sure you agree, Tim, than in Steve's hands, right?
Indeed.
Yeah. Wow. So Steve's a wonderful guy. And then the UR19s, let me pluralize that. Those were sold as well on the East Coast. There's usually somebody clamoring for one of the UR19s. I think you'll agree those aren't hard to sell if you choose to sell them. And it looks like your garden is littered with them as well. And if anybody in Ohio is wondering why there is a shortfall of them, you have no one to blame but Tim.
I'll take the blame.
Guilty as charged, sir. And then it came to the second pair of SKE heads that Paul had in his possession. And Paul didn't know a great deal about these heads. He just bought them from Smokey. Smokey wasn't known to be very informative, even when he was selling something to you. It was kind of as is, where is, are your Benjamins good? As long as your Benjamins are good, it's this dollar amount for this item. And that's the end of the transaction. And that's it. And that's what took place. And the same thing with the second pair of heads. So Paul didn't have a lot of background on those heads. He just knew he ran them, the original pair, and that they never leaked water or anything like that. And they never cracked, so he ran them. Same thing with the second pair of heads, except for he didn't run them. He had never run them. They'd been magged, but they hadn't been run. So he knew even really less about them experientially as to whether or not, how much you could port through or whatever with them. But he asked me, could I possibly find a suitor for them, somebody that would buy them, because he knew that I was kind of a collector and evaluator of these things and all of that. And then out of curiosity, he also asked me, Chad, would you happen to know anything about these heads? Not just would you know somebody to buy them, would you know anybody that could tell me about them, even though I'm not keeping them? And I think that I've, written up or composed a little bit of anecdotes about it that feel free to share, Tim, to the viewing community if you would like. What I talked to my various colleagues and mentors as well, and we did a write-up about it, and I shared that with Paul at the time. I want to say that was in the early 2000s, and like I said, you're welcome to disseminate that to the community. Sure. But I sent that to Paul, and then he kind of just scratched his head and said, "Oh, okay, that's interesting." And then there was a gentleman down in Australia who, once again, I don't know who had ever referred him to me. I don't have a website. This is not what I do for a living. Right. If it did, I wouldn't make much of a living. I got other things to do. But somebody had referred that gentleman to me. I think I had sold something many, many years ago. I think I had sold an alloy SK FE block, like a real aluminum 427, FE block to somebody down in Australia. And arranged the shipping for it. And that person said, well, if you want some weird Cleveland stuff, this guy up there is a Cleveland guy. He did sell me an FE, but he's really a Cleveland guy, not really an FE guy, but you should probably start with him. So that person reached out to me and said, hey, do you have any weird Cleveland stuff that you'd be willing to part with? And I said, well, you should probably buy a lottery ticket and get out some Lucky Charms. Today's your day. I just so happen to have these SKE iron heads, which are very, very rare, very unique. And, if you're interested in them, I can figure out, we can figure out a price and we'll arrange transport for them. And the guy said, well, I'd be very interested in those. And then he also purchased, at the time I had one XE Cleveland, the later block, the 82 blocks. Yeah. With the sonic test sheet in the Ford crate. Oh. That it was from, I believe it was from Cale Yarborough's shop. Yeah, it was from Cale Yarborough's shop, and it was still in the crate. It had been, but it had the Ford Sonic check sheet on it because people, some of the gadflies out there in the community go back and forth about which ones were thinner and thicker, and frankly, they don't really know. There's a lot of talk about those guys, but unless you've had one or had several, as I have had, and I believe you've had several,
Yes.
I've had several or had engines that ran several. I would tend to more trust what I've done or what I've had versus the internet expert stuff that just gets traded back and bandied back and forth and takes on a life of its own. So I had NOS XE early 80s Cleveland block with the Sonic check sheet from, I believe, Cale Yarborough's shop out there, and this gentleman was interested in that, and I had enough of those blocks at the time and he had a very unique project. And I'm keeping his name confidential because, he didn't, it was a private transaction, but I wanted to help him with his restoration. So that's really the only reason I parted with that block. I tend to reserve those types of things for people that are doing historic restorations so that the block or intake or whatever can be best used for its original intention, original purpose. I won't even advertise it. But in this case, that was a situation where I sent that block down south, and I also sent this set of SKE iron heads to the gentleman down south, and he was delighted, Tim, to say the least. He was delighted because he didn't know those existed, and I can understand most people didn't. He didn't figure with a discussion with me that he would come across something that he was certain no one down under would possibly have, right? And there's rare pieces down under, there are, but these heads are relatively rare. Even in the rareness of prototype pieces, they're pretty rare even in North America. There's many of us that have trafficked in these things for over a quarter of a century, nearly a half a century, that's the first pair I had laid eyes on in my life or had heard of. So they're rare enough. Now you could argue that, subsequent iterations of the head that ended up evolving into the 4V Cleveland Quench head that we all know that was released for passenger car use was a better head. But that's not really the point of this conversation. It's that we always want to fill in the gaps in history and things like that. And this is a crucial point in the chronology of the Cleveland head. It's a 68 Cleveland head. We know the alloy Cleveland heads are there from 68 and the blocks, the alloy blocks.
Yeah.
This is the iron SK head, which is different from the alloy SK head in its design and everything else. So it is an important part in that history. This guy was going to honor that and had great reverence for it and was like a schoolgirl giddy once it landed with him down under. He was, he was thanking me in so many ways and hurling platitudes my way. And that alone is worth the price of admission when you can bring that kind of joy to somebody who is going to treasure that Cleveland piece. It's worth it for it to leave North America as long as it's in the hands of a candid valve fanatic like you and I. He's one of our brethren. He's just down under.
That's it. I wonder, and I'm going to say this in the beginning of the video, that this Cleveland head is the originator, the first Cleveland head to be made. This is where it came from. And that's how I'm going to label this, because it is really. That's the precursor of the the iron 74V head. That's how I'm going to list it. So it's raining here so I can hear it. But do you think that 68 block I have complements those heads?
I do, Tim. I do. And for 2 points, I'll give you a twofold answer. Not that I haven't used enough of the oxygen in the room so far, but I believe, we both believe, that we have never seen an earlier iron head.
Indeed,
okay?
I agree.
And you're east, and I'm west, and so we've seen some stuff, and we're not kids. We got probably more in our rear. We probably got more life in the back of us than we do ahead of us. So you and I have seen some stuff. Between the two of us, we got a half a century of life. So we've seen some stuff. You've probably been to Carlisle any number of times. I've
And
been
Hershey.
to, and Hershey, right? And I've been to equivalent gatherings out here, and definitely was at the Mickey Thompson garage when I was a kid, and the Holman Moody Strop auctions out here, and Allen Root out here, and Ford Powered Parts out here, and many other private collections that that we don't divulge. So we've seen some stuff, and I'm not saying that I've seen everything. That certainly would be foolhardy and arrogant. But I'll say these are the earliest iron heads I have ever seen. True Cleveland iron heads. They're the earliest I've seen. And I believe they're the earliest you've seen, right?
Indeed, they are.
And your iron block is the earliest iron block you've seen.
Never seen one earlier than the 68.
Correct?
Correct.
And your iron block is the earliest iron block you've seen, right?
It is. I've never seen an earlier Cleveland block than 68.
And so these are dry deck heads with or these are kind of unique heads with the water running through the side, with the end points and all of that. Certainly Ford made what we can call improvements subsequent to that. They did not seem to run these heads since then, but it's important to probably acknowledge that much later derivatives of the Cleveland head do run the water out of the ends, right?
Sure they do.
Much later, right?
Yeah.
Right? Much later heads do. So as usual, Ford was light years ahead of their time with the development of the Dominator carburetor, with these Cleveland canted valve heads, with so many other things that they did, which I won't bore you and regale you with at the moment. But these heads are, I think we've reached alignment here that these are the earliest heads, and we are happy to be wrong. By the way, let me say that to your viewing community. We're happy to be wrong, and if we are wrong, we'll be sincerely wrong, but we'll be happily wrong, because we want everybody to go into Grandpa's shed, and Mom's knitting barn, and pull out anything that you have that's earlier, because we're all teaching each other. There's a biblical term, iron sharpens iron, right?
Indeed, it does.
I don't believe you've ever claimed to know it all. If there are earlier iterations of the iron block and iron head, we would be over the moon to see those and to see how they fit in the chronology of the evolvement of the Cleveland head. Nobody would be happier to see that than me. And speaking for you, no one would be happier than you to see that as well.
Be awesome.
But we've at least fitted in some of the chronology by looking at these heads. And I believe I shared some photos with you, which you'll show the viewing community as you determine and as you wish. Those are all the photos I have. It's only a sample of the photos I sent to the buyer, but those are all the photos I had kind of before I cleaned them or after I cleaned them, just to ensure that whatever I was trafficking in, so to speak, was what I described it. My reputation matters to me.
Indeed.
And it's not a good deal unless the selling party and the buying party both walk away from the party very satisfied. So for my own peace of mind, I took a fair amount of photos of them and different angles of them prior to even offering them to the seller or to the buyer to purchase. And those are the photos that I shared with you, which I pulled off of my 3 Dell laptops ago, is where those photos were. I bought
photos.
Yeah, I bought a Lenovo since then, if you guys are wondering. But those are 3 Dell laptops ago. So it's a good thing that I had those around and that I was able to salvage those photos off of there, and that I could share them with you for the wider viewing audience. So that's kind of the Paul Jenkins story. I was able to help him derive as much financial value as he could from his pro stock parts. And the buyer received those and was incredibly happy with them. And I was able to, of course, through my relationships with others, be able to document as much as we could. So I think it's a win-win for everybody, for the buyer, for the seller, and for the historians out there. And things like that are what bring me pleasure. And you don't always have to own a race car, guys. You don't always have to own a big trailer and a stacker trailer, or have a big diesel crew cab You can participate in this hobby in so many other ways. If I could just, my closing remarks on that. I remember a guy at OCIR, the famous Orange County International Raceway. He was he's an older gentleman. And the way that he participated in the hobby is he was a master at embroidery. And no matter what you had, if you had a jacket, a patch, it doesn't matter. He had a thread color that could match anything you had, Tim. And he could embroider your nickname on there, your girlfriend's nickname on there. He could embroider a design on there. He could take a patch and match it and all of that. And he was as central to the fabric, pun on words, of the racing community at OCIR as much as Don Prudhomme was. And we loved Don. Saw him a couple of months ago at Mike Poole's funeral. But he was as important in our minds and in the memory of all of us, especially as kids that were walking around the pits. There was that guy embroidering a street racer's jacket, a top-level drag racer's jacket, an independence jacket. And remember all the photographers that have blessed us with all these wonderful photographs from that period, which helped jog my memory about all the different pro stock racers and top fuel racers and funny car racers that I used to bother in the pits as a kid. They all matter. They all factor into the ecosystem of drag racing and the mechanics, right? And the folks that did the crew work and the Linda Vaughns who were there for promotion, right? And Jungle Pam, right? And the embroidery guys, and the guys who traded contingency stickers and gave out stickers, and the people who sold the memorabilia, and the people who sold the hot dogs and the burgers at the stands, and the bands that would play on these mobile trailers and that would do their rock music, in between rounds or something like that, and the manufacturers that would come out and press the flesh and say hello to everybody and give out in t-shirt giveaways. And the exhibition racers with their wheelie trucks and their jet cars, all of that factors in. So I would just kind of like to say that to the viewing community, no matter how small or large a part you played into this, don't minimize it. Your part was very, very important to really just show us the kaleidoscope of God-given talent and ability that you contributed to the full experience of drag racing in the 70s and in the 80s, before it, sadly became as corporate as it was. Each of you really mattered to that. The magazines, the National Dragsters, right? All the other different magazines that people contributed to and that we collected and traded, all of that, the feature articles that were in there, all of that's what helps keep the memory alive in synergy with all that you're doing, Tim. So those are really kind of my closing remarks, unless you have any closing remarks for me or you'd like to, ask me anything else.
I'm speechless for once.
Well, I took all the oxygen out of the room. I'm like a fire suppression system.
But it's so true. No truer words have been said because, that's the way I look at it. I may have all these fancy parts back here, but I worked and scrimped and saved to get them. I had nothing. I used to bring my slicks in the back of my truck or my car and unload them and have a pit, and tools out laying on the ground. I mean, I did all that stuff.
Yeah.
You can start anywhere. Anything that you were involved with, this kind of genre is important, to keep it alive, to show people, hey, this is what we got. This is where it came from, before it's all gone, because it isn't going to be here forever. This is like the last hurrah.
But it really is. With fossil fuel, obviously facing near its end, depending on how green your state is, but it's coming. I think we all want to honor and remember those who have passed and those that are in the twilight of their life, and thank them. Especially, by the way, you had Rusty on the other day. I remember Rusty very, very well, and of course his family, and we'll talk later about
Sure.
maybe some other stuff. But I remember how accommodating all of these racers were, and I'll never forget it. And we'll talk about that in subsequent discussions, I imagine, online or offline. But I couldn't be more grateful and in more debt to how welcoming they were to these kids like me who wandered the pits, asked inane questions, were likely in the way of their light while they were adjusting their clutch, and asking for a t-shirt right after they had lost a round, or any of the other things and missteps that we as children make because we can't read the room yet. We're young. And they couldn't have been more inviting and kind. And that's my reflections and experience from it. And I can't thank all of the racers more enough for all of that experience during my formative years.
As they were mine. 75, I was 10. That's where I keep going back to. I can remember all that kind of stuff because you were probably in the same age bracket.
Yes, I am.
Okay. We won't talk about our age because that's people don't want to hear that. But here's what I'll leave with you because I know I want to have more interviews and conversations, but we've talked already for about 40-something minutes. So I don't want to take any more time, but I want to maybe give you some topics that maybe you can reflect on next before we come back together maybe.
Oh, sure.
Maybe
Okay, sure.
A couple guys at a time because there's so many people to think about. Bob Glidden, Dino Don, Lee Hunter, who else? There's Mark DeGraff, Mullins. I'm just learning about Mullins. I didn't know that he did a W2 head. There's so much more.
Sure.
Maybe you could do some reflections on these guys for us.
Oh, absolutely, Ken. Would be happy to share all that I have and know about them for others and for yourself to collate with their experiences and memories of them. Would be happy to, Tim. It would be my pleasure and my privilege to talk about them at any level and depth that you are comfortable with, and it would be a privilege. And by the way, it's a privilege to be on your broadcast today. I celebrate all those that have been my predecessors in the broadcast, and I encourage everybody else within your viewing and listening community to engage Tim and to join the broadcast as you deem appropriate for that which you think is useful and encouraging to cultivate this sport and this hobby and to cultivate this channel and further Tim's success on it.
I'm going to bring it back. Like I said, I kind of wanted to, I've talked to people. I'm going to get a membership where they can get shirts, some Glidden shirts. I'm working with Rusty on some memorabilia, a book of photos. We're working on some T-shirts. I mean, we're going to bring this. This is going to get big, and I'm glad that you're in on the ground floor, Reverend. I really am.
It's my pleasure, and you're as humble as ever, Tim, because the fact of the matter is, comparatively, it's already big.
All right.
I think you can go viral. I think you can go nuclear, man. It's time to hit the button. I think it's happening for you, and it couldn't happen to a nicer guy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You got in the game, and you carried it forward. So I fully support you in any way, and I'll be in prayer and thoughts, obviously, for you, our family, and our larger Cleveland community. Thank you very much for the time that you've offered today.
Thank you. We'll see you next time around, so stay tuned, guys.
Thank you.